Hello. Whoa. Here we are. We're back. How are you, Madrid? Thank you. Thank you. I was saying, we have a fantastic first keynote speaker to start the day. He barely needs a presentation because he is a successful serial entrepreneur. 7 companies in the last 20 years and counting. He's not only an entrepreneur, he's also a teacher, a mentor, a business angel, he's a writer, and he always speaks his mind out. And he really believes and says what he thinks. He's here to talk about babies, but he was also mentioned, well, he's a visionary. He was described by Forbes as a young, rich, and restless person, and that was in 1999. Well, today, in 2019, he's still very young, he's probably much richer, and he's a restless father of 7. So apparently 7 is his magic number, 7 companies, 7 children, and he's here because he believes that everybody should have babies when they are ready and use technological innovation to help them to do that. So he's here to tell us about it. Do you want to hear it? Yes! Please, let's welcome Martin Varsavsky.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm here to teach you how to make a baby, right? And which I have made 7. I think I would dare to say that nobody in this auditorium has more children. I have a hard time finding people who have more children. But I have made thousands of babies at my company, right? Because Prelude Fertility is the largest chain of fertility clinics in the United States. We're also building another company here in Spain and in Cambridge that makes a robot that makes babies, okay? And I think you're probably trying to figure out now how does this robot make babies? I'm going to leave you with that thought for a while. So why are we helping people make babies with technology? And the answer is because the baby boomers, the people who had the most babies, the people who had babies in the 1950s or so, didn't have much of a problem to make babies because they made babies in their 20s. They made babies in their teens and 20s. And human beings are biologically programmed to have babies in their teens and 20s. That's why there's so many issues with teenage pregnancy. You know, they kiss and they make a baby, right? But people who want to make babies now want to make babies between 30 and 45. And when you systematically want to make babies between 30 and 45, you fail a third of the times over your life, okay? It is incredible how frequently people fail at making babies because they make them when it's biologically too late, right? Last year in the United States, and in Europe it's even worse, by the way, 20% of women who turned 45 had no babies, and another 22% only had 1. But these same women, when they were asked how many babies they wanted to have, they said they wanted to have between 2 and 3 when they were in their 20s. So here's this group of women that wanted to have between 2 and 3 babies, and ended up almost half of them had no babies or 1 baby, right? And the problem here is a problem also of information. Like, occasionally, a woman who's 45 with no help has a baby. And therefore, everyone else thinks it's easy. I only need to train. I only need to be fit. I only need to be healthy. But unfortunately, having babies has nothing to do with those things. You cannot train to have a baby. It's a question of the obsolescence of the eggs an egg of a 25-year-old woman is worth maybe 2 eggs of a 30-year-old woman, is worth maybe 4 eggs of a 35-year-old woman, and it's worth maybe 10 eggs of a 40-year-old woman, and it's worth maybe 20 eggs of 42, 43, and then it becomes really difficult. And it's not that people have no babies. Like in Spain, for example, in the 70s, there were a 35-year-old woman would have on average 3 babies, and now a Spanish woman has only 1 at 35 on average. Another thing that is shocking, though, and will surprise anyone in Spain, is that Spain is the country in the world that has the most IVF treatments in comparison to its population. In America, there's 200,000 IVF cycles for 330 million people, and in Spain, there's 110,000 cycles for 45 million people. So in Spain, there's a hugely developed IVF industry because people in Spain have one of the lowest birth rates in the world. And they have babies the latest in the world. People want to have like marcha, and they want to have a great time, and they want to extend their years of being single, but then they have real problems having babies. So what can you do about this? How can you make babies reliably in 2019, in 2020, in the next 10 years? And the answer is using technology. So what technology is available to make babies? Well, the first one is egg freezing, right? Egg freezing is a technology that works quite well. I mean, it's not a guarantee. You could freeze your eggs and then maybe you're not able to have a baby. But if you don't freeze your eggs, then it's much less likely that you will have a baby, let's say, between 35 and 45. So freezing eggs is not as easy as freezing sperm. Freezing sperm, with the help of an iPad, maybe it takes 10 minutes. Maybe it takes 3, maybe 1, I don't know. Freezing eggs takes 2 weeks, okay? And it's not easy. But my wife, who froze her eggs, and we had 3 babies using IVF, when she was asked how hard is it to freeze eggs, she said, well, what do you want to compare to, a bikini wax? And I mean, women do a lot of things that are painful. She said that was something comparable to a bikini wax. And also she said that compared to what comes afterwards, because of course you freeze eggs, but then there's the pregnancy, and then there's the birth. That compared to birth, certainly freezing eggs is a piece of cake. The question is, you say, well, why should you compare it to giving birth? Well, because you're comparing to what the eggs are for. They are for freezing eggs. And so the whole idea here is that egg freezing works, and egg freezing prevents infertility. It's a statistical game. And that's very difficult to understand. People are still wondering how Trump, with only 10% chance, he won the US election. And the answer is, well, he didn't really win the popular vote. He got 3 million less votes. But because of the system in the United States, he won, because things that have a 10% chance of happening sometimes happen. So yes, you will find women in their 40s who can have babies without problem, for sure. But it is a small group of women who can achieve that. And the question is, what is the reliability that you want when you start a family? Like, we don't take planes that crash 30% of the time. We don't drive cars that fail 30% of the time. But we fail 30% of the time at having babies, okay? And that's pretty sad, okay? Now, the other issue that I wanted to talk to you about is about this company. So Prelude Fertility, as I said, the largest chain of clinics in the US. We make thousands of babies. People come and they do egg freezing and IVF with us. But what about Overture? What is my other fertility company? How can you have a robot that makes babies? Okay, what is this concept of a robot that makes babies? Well, right now, babies are made by hand, and I don't mean making babies having sex. I mean an embryologist who picks up sperm and sticks it into an egg, and that's called ICSI. And they make babies by hand. The whole embryology lab right now, if you go to any embryology lab in Spain, which, by the way, they're producing an incredible amount of babies. Like if you went to a kindergarten in Madrid today, one child in 10 will have been made in a lab, okay? It is extremely common to make babies in labs. I even heard of a clinic in Spain that organizes tours, so when kids at 12, they are taught sex education and how babies are made, they go to an IVF clinic because so many babies are made in IVF clinics, right? By the way, my daughter Hussein, she asked me how babies are made, and I didn't even have to tell her about sex. You know, I told her about a lab, right? Which is actually, for children, it's interesting, but when they're little, it's easier for them to talk about the lab than to actually talk about sex, you know, especially when they're something like 8, right? And so, what is this robot that makes embryos? Like, how do you have a robot that makes embryos? Well, we have a team here in Madrid working on these, in Cambridge, UK, and in Madrid. What we're doing is we're automating the embryology lab. So instead of having a lab that's maybe 300 square meters with many different people and station to station, when you collect the sperm and you get the eggs, which come in the form of follicular fluid, which is like 100 milliliters of follicular fluid, and you have to find the eggs there, you have to singulate them, you have to incubate them, you have to inseminate them, you have to cultivate them, you have to genetically test them. Instead of doing all these things by hand, what we are doing is we are working on robotizing, on automating the whole embryology lab. So you start with sperm and eggs, you put them in this machine, and 6 days later you get genetically tested frozen embryos. I'm going to ask one thing. Where's the timer that tells me how much time do I have? Okay, thank you. Well, quite a bit of time. That's good. Because I wanted to explain more about how genetic testing of embryos works. So the question here is, people say, oh, I just want a baby, I just want a baby. And it's true, people want a baby. But the truth, the real truth, is people want healthy babies. There's a lot of illness that kill babies. Well, there's a lot of illnesses that result in spontaneous abortions. But then there's a lot of illnesses that result in death of children, right? Young children. And there's 2 types of illnesses along these lines. Some are called Mendelian illnesses, and they're illnesses that have monogenic causes. It is, you just identify one gene, and you can predict whether the child will have thalassemia, sickle cell anemia, cystic fibrosis, and many others. And there's other illnesses that are more complex and that have a lot of genes that are involved in the creation of this illness. For example, it is believed that severe mental illness has genetic origins, but billions have been found trying to understand severe mental illness, and it hasn't been possible. So the question is, when you have a machine that makes human embryos, can you also make healthy babies or increase the probability of having healthy babies? Because again, this is always a game of probabilities, and there will always be things you do not catch. So our last child, Ben, he's 2.5. You can imagine with me having 7 children, when I was going to have my 7th child, I was really concerned about the health of my last child. I don't know if you ever heard the expression that you're only as happy as your saddest child, right? But I think when you have a child with a serious illness or a child that may die during childhood, it's a pretty sorry state of affairs for you as a parent. Like, you become obsessed with whatever may happen to this child because you tend to focus on the child with the most problems. So the question is, does genetic testing make sense? And I have a lot of people who say, are you making designer babies? Well, the answer is we're not making good-looking, taller babies. We're not making smarter babies. We're just making babies that are very unlikely to have a set of diseases, maybe 1,000 illnesses, that are pretty bad. And I think that while some of you in this audience may oppose IVF altogether, and some of you may oppose genetic testing of embryos, I don't know if you're aware of this, but the most common testing now is not done on embryos. It's done on women who are pregnant of 4 months. And then they do certain type of genetic testing, amnios or other type of genetic testing, and then they abort. And that is sad. It's sad when you very much wanted to have a child, and you're 4 months into the pregnancy. So the alternative of genetically testing embryos, it is certainly better than aborting way into the pregnancy. I want you to think of this before you become negative on genetically testing embryos. Of course, there's what Prelude offers and what Overture offers is a choice. Like, nobody has to do this. And I completely understand people who, for religious objections, may not want to have any of these, may not want to do IVF, may not. I've had people who have criticized me for religious reasons, but I have people who have told me, religious people, who have said that Prelude and Overture actually do God's work, okay? I guess I'm somewhere in between. I'm not a religious person myself. In any case, if I was, I would be Jewish, and interestingly, in the Jewish religion, there's not this understanding that a person is a person at conception. A person is believed to be a person after birth, which kind of makes sense to me. But in any case, the genetic testing of embryos is something that is one of the great advances of society because of the social grief, the emotional cost of severe illnesses in babies, and because of the economic cost. In the US, it costs around $1 million per baby that's born with a severe genetic illness. So, and genetic illnesses are only 2% of pediatric illnesses, but they are 22% of the total cost of pediatric care. So there's economic incentive, and there's a social incentive, and there's an emotional incentive to test embryos. And our natural life, our machine that will make embryos, will not only make embryos, but it will also test embryos. So to summarize, you thought I was going to talk about sex, and I completely disappointed you. I ended up talking about robots and machines. This is not a conversation against sex. Sex is great. It's just not great to make babies in your 30s and 40s. Thank you.